Hello and welcome to a new episode of Other Record Labels. Happy 2019. If you've been following along since the beginning, thank you. And we took a little break over the holidays. However, I've been interviewing a bunch of new labels, and this is going to be the craziest batch of labels that we've ever had, starting right now today with Sub Pop. This is the absolute truth that, you know, if you are starting a podcast where you plan to interview independent record labels, then your ultimate dream is to interview Sub Pop. They are right there at the top, you know, the first label to sign Nirvana. Don't hold me to that, but I'm pretty sure. And then, of course, you know, Flight of the Conchords and Fleet Foxes and Father John Misty and the Shins and Postal Service. Just name after name of new stuff too, and new artists that they're already signing and have made an impact this past year. Thank you for listening on. If you're just checking out the podcast today, make sure you visit us at otherrecordlabels.com. You can email me at info@otherrecordlabels.com, and make sure you check out our previous episodes, and please subscribe. If I had gotten my act together over the holidays, I was hoping to put together a Patreon page for this podcast, you know, with some t-shirts and stickers, but I didn't get my act together. Instead, I just relaxed and interviewed some great labels like this one, Sub Pop, with the marketing director, Carly Starr. What an honor. First of all, thank you so much for doing this. This is the end for me. After doing this podcast, this is I've hit the summit now. There's nowhere to go from here.
Oh, geez.
It's true. Thank you very much.
Of course.
We're talking today with Carly Starr from Sub Pop, home of the Shins and Postal Service and Fleet Foxes and Band of Horses and many, many more. I'm really curious, as I was going through everything and realizing the history, and I mean, it's 30 years this year. Happy birthday.
Thank
you.
But
I'm so curious, like, basically, how does a 30-year-old label that has sold millions of records still maintain indie cred? How do you stay gritty and cool and not become this massive label?
That's a really good question. You know, it probably comes down to one of the co-founders and co-presidents, Jonathan Poneman. He still is very active in Sub Pop and has really maintained what he sought out to do is just, you know, put out music he loves. And there's a lot of other key people that I work with that have been here for a really long time. And even though we've grown, I think, pretty significantly over the past 10 years or so,
Mm-hmm.
It's still the same. It's still the same.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a total trip.
Yeah, for sure. How does I imagine that over the years, there's probably been opportunities that label has turned down in order to kind of maintain that core mission and vision. Is that true?
Yeah, you know, and I think it's more of, oh, man, you know, I think a lot of times we get really lucky with the bands that, you know, we start working with and build relationships with and that want to continue to work with us and vice versa. You know, this past year was one of the crazy years where almost all of our current bands wanted to put an album out. It just happens that way, that some years are really, really busy and then others are lighter. And this year's coincided with the 30th as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's kind of nice.
Yeah, it was a lot. But yeah, it's been...
Can the label, with the size of the label and the expectations that come with the brand, is Sub Pop still able to take chances on weird music, or is there
for sure?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think having our more, you know, having a few key significant bands that you know are going to do, you know, X makes it able to take smaller risks.
Right.
And it's really cool when you can kind of team those bands up with each other, and hopefully some of our larger acts will take the smaller ones out on tour, and it's And I think it is because of that. It's because we, have such a strong back catalog, a lot of really, really current artists that are doing really, really well, that we're able to take smaller chances.
Speaking of larger artists and weird music, I have to say I am so excited for this Low record that's coming out. Now, these episodes are recorded like months in advance. So I'm going to call it right now. And I bet you when this episode comes out, it may be at the end of the year. And I don't want to jinx it, but I think that that's going to be like a top 5, top 3 album of the year for everybody, that new Low record.
That's awesome.
I'm calling it. I'm calling it. You've heard it here first.
Isn't it?
I've actually.
Isn't it so amazing?
Well, and I mean, I just heard it in full on NPR this week, but I've played those 3 songs like maybe 1,000 times this summer.
Yeah,
it's mind blowing.
Yeah. It's so great. Here's a really cheesy segue. So I grew up in Wisconsin, and I have been seeing Low perform since I was like 16.
Oh, wow.
And it's such a trip to be able to work with them. And, I've been at Sub Pop for almost 16 years.
Wow.
So, but just like having a band like that consistently in my life that I'm a fan of, and then having them put out this album is like so awesome to see, people's responses to it, and just, it's amazing.
I think some of the reviews I'm reading already, it's interesting because it's because of their history and because of their longevity. To be able to put out a record like this, like of that Yankee Hotel quality, I think a lot of people, it's even more special than if it were just this brand new band.
Totally.
Well, I'm really excited to hear that, and I hope I don't jinx it, but I think Pitchfork will put it in the top 3. I certainly am.
Knocking on wood, whatever that is next to me.
I wanted to ask you about the historical sound of the label, that Seattle sound. Like even on your website, you joke about exploiting that grunge sound. How do you stay true to that primal sound and still evolve and experiment? It is such an iconic sound, but it's also tied to the 90s and tied to certain records. And do you guys still reference that sound? Do you still exploit that? What does that mean to you guys?
I think, there's been waves of what the Seattle sound is.
Okay.
Right. And this is just my opinion, of course. But, I think, going back to when the label started and the grunge days, like we're we have a new Mudhoney album coming out in a few weeks, and we still are doing reissues and deluxe versions of some of the catalog from the early 90s.
Right.
And people still love it.
Right.
And then you have like different phases of when I think of like Fleet Foxes and Head in the Heart and other, local bands and Band of Horses. Like, there's different throughout the label's existence. I think the sound, in doing some air quotes here, sound of Seattle has changed. It's not just grunge.
Right.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And what I thought was really interesting, and you guys are based in Seattle, and my goodness, somebody needs to do a thesis on like why so many labels come out of the Pacific Northwest, because I don't know why, but we've interviewed tons, more so than in New York, but it seems like a great scene.
Yeah, and I just wonder if it's because there's so many transplants here. Like it's kind of rare that you meet people from...
Oh, really?
Yeah, from the Northwest originally.
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe.
So
you're not giving it. You're not giving Seattle any credit.
You get like 2 months of sunshine, and then the rest of it, you're kind of like inside thinking of what are you going to do?
Yeah. What's interesting about Seattle, and one of the things I read about the label, is in the early days, I think it was a founder who really clung to Seattle, and the founders believed that a label needed a region as part of their identity, like Motown or Sun Records in Memphis. Is that regional basis still applicable today?
I would say so, yeah. Jonathan, one of the founders, definitely feels very proud to be in Seattle.
Hmm.
And like even where our offices are downtown Seattle, they've always been downtown Seattle,
Oh, okay.
kind of just like in the thick of it. And so I think he feels a really strong connection to the city, to the Northwest. Um, and it's rad over, the past few years, many years, I guess, seeing other labels pop up like Barsook and Suicide Squeeze and, um, just having
Hmm.
friends and more colleagues here because sometimes it can feel kind of isolating.
Right. Is that still true today for other labels? Do you think? I mean, because it sounded like from what I read that it was like an entrepreneurial thought that he had that he needs to identify with a region in order to kind of as a branding thing. Do you think that's true for
Uh
other labels?
huh. I think so. I do.
That's good. I'm
Like
not
I even
sure.
think of
Yeah.
like when I was like growing up, I was really into like Jade Tree or,
Right.
I can look back at like other labels and kind of like associate bands that they worked with. And it's usually, there's a lot from a particular area. I guess Jade Tree was East Coast and I'm thinking of more Midwest bands, but um,
Well,
yeah,
I think there is some sort of mystery and romance with a city you've never been to or that you're as far
for
away.
sure. For
And,
sure.
even just like Memphis or New York City to people in Europe or, I'm Canadian. So anything on the West Coast is so intriguing to me that people,
Yeah.
so interesting. I, um, I wanted to, I found this really cool, actually, just kind of a side note. This podcast, Other Record Labels, focuses on indie record labels, and I just learned that Sub Pop means Subterranean Pop, which started as a magazine for
Yeah.
American indie labels. Is that true?
Yes. It was kind of like a fanzine that Bruce, Jonathan's partner, started. Um,
Are there copies kicking around the office?
I don't think I've ever seen one.
Really? Oh,
No.
interesting. And was
No.
it geared towards like labels, or was it just about labels? I'm
That
sorry,
is a
I'm
good
challenging your
question.
history.
I know, I know.
I'm sorry.
I think I've heard a few different versions of
Okay,
this.
okay.
um, yeah, and he also had Bruce, I think at the time also had like a radio show that he was calling by that name. This could be wrong. Now I
Oh,
could just be
okay.
giving you wrong information. So,
Do you know when it was chopped off? Like when it just became Sub Pop?
it must have been like the late 80s,
Okay.
89
Yeah,
maybe.
probably when
Yeah,
it became, yeah, I
an
see.
actual label.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right, right. We talked about, I've talked about this a lot with other labels, smaller labels who have their own kind of distinct sound. But when we look at the bands like Postal Service, versus Fleet Foxes or something like that, or the Head and the Heart versus the New Low record, there's very few sonic similarities
Yeah.
between these records, but they're all successful. Like, what do you think makes a successful record? Do you think there needs to be a common thread for record labels in their sound, or?
Um, I don't, mainly because we don't
Yeah,
right now.
yeah.
Like our roster varies so much. And I think it's one of the best things about working at Sub Pop is that even though I've been here for such a long time, never gets old because you're working with new bands. But even if they're the same band, you're constantly working with different albums. And we genuinely try to approach each release as its own thing,
Hmm.
and come up with its own marketing plan. And what if we put out, 5 tracks ahead of release from that album? And how
Right.
about we do like a really shortened release plan for this album? And let's try to get a video done in time for the album launch. And we're constantly kind of tweaking what we do. And a lot of it, comes from the actual band and how
Right.
much they want to participate and what ideas they're bringing to the table. Lowe had a totally clear vision of, we want to do these 3 songs prior to release. We want these,
Oh, okay.
these videos are done beforehand, which is always so awesome when a band comes in kind of knowing that, and then you
Right.
can help them see that through,
Right. That was
you
such
know.
a great idea, especially on a record where if you were to just isolate a single and show it to
Right.
people, whereas that trilogy, I mean, I took that trilogy on walks this summer and it was like just being in a mini movie, like it's
Yeah.
just insane.
Yeah.
That's so
Totally.
cool. So if there's the sound isn't a common thread, in your opinion, is there a common thread? Is there something? Is it the songwriting? Is it the creativity of the artist? What do you think it is?
I guess I feel like the common thread more comes from Sub Pop and not so much the albums.
Mm,
Everyone, in order to like kind of sign a band or to put an album out, people here genuinely have to love it and be excited about it.
right.
And so that is the one thing that sticks out to me. And it's really cool because no matter how different, you know, the bands are or the albums are, it's so cool, especially when we just had like our big 30th, when bands get to meet and you would never expect certain bands to kind of hit it off and become friends with each other
Right.
because they sound totally different, and it's a really awesome thing to watch because I do feel like the connection maybe is just the label.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, that is really cool. It's kind of like when like when two TV shows do like a crossover episode on the same
Yeah.
network, but in a much
Yep.
cooler way.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
at times it can feel like, well, this is totally random, and then you're like,
right.
but it's working.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know,
The growth of Sub Pop in the history of the label is heavily linked to Nirvana. Can you explain that connection and what impact Nirvana has had on Sub Pop?
Um, I think I think it's probably had the biggest impact. Obviously, it's
Right,
the
right.
biggest impact. It's kind of, um, people are still discovering that album and that band
Wow. Wow.
daily and
Yeah.
weekly.
Wow.
And even though we wouldn't maybe think that, like, the sales and the streaming numbers, but people are still discovering it, and
Unbelievable. Yeah.
it's kind of, it's a really cool thing to watch still, and especially being on the other end. I was in middle school when Nirvana
Yeah.
started
Same.
blowing
Yeah.
up, and to be able to remember that and to still see it like kind of be relevant is really, really awesome.
It's such a magical thing about music.
Yeah.
To think, I actually heard, to quote the great philosopher John Mayer, I actually heard him talking about something and how he was kind of lamenting that his fans, he lost some of his fans, but he said when it comes to like young music fans, they keep making more of them. You may have lost those people, they may have become parents or something, but they just keep making more college age students who like music. And I think that's kind of the magical thing of like Nirvana. It's like I remember listening to some of those records at like house parties, and not house parties, but like basement parties in grades 7
Right.
and
Yeah.
8. And seeing kids wearing these t-shirts, but that's probably still happening for kids in grade 7 or 8
Oh,
today.
totally. Yep.
That's
Yep.
unbelievable. And I
Yep.
think the beautiful thing too is to think if and when that happens with Father John Misty in 20 years from now,
Right.
people are
Yep.
digging out their parents' records.
Yep. And it's like you won't know. You don't know.
Yeah, you don't know.
Who knows what's going to be the next like hidden gem that comes back up. Like people all of a sudden are really into, you know, whatever. And yeah.
I wonder, like, you've been there for 16 years. Do you ever get a sense when something is just feeling really special? Like I was looking at some of your biggest records, and the Postal Service, which I imagine it was a side project. I imagine that must have been a little bit of a surprise. or
Yeah.
or like just out of nowhere records like The Head and the Heart. Has some of what surprised you over the years?
Uh, Um, yeah, a lot of what you mentioned, super surprising, but you can sometimes tell.
You can feel it,
Like, well, most of the time you can kind of tell, and even internally, there'll just kind of be a buzz about
right?
certain things, and it'll start to take off, and then it just goes and goes and goes. And there's kind of been different. I feel like I've been here long enough to see different waves of it. Um, and more recently, uh, this year, the one that, and it's so interesting too, and especially because you're in Canada, and even though it's just across the border.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's, like Wolf Parade, and we work with a handful of
right.
Canadian bands that are
Mm,
just do really, really well in Canada. And so having that phenomenon happen, like, so this year, like you mentioned,
mm,
Low is like, they're doing great here in the States, but they are so massive overseas. And just seeing all of that stuff unfold in the UK,
wow.
on this album is so awesome, and in France and Germany and the Netherlands. But in particular, this year, there's this band called that we work with from Australia called Rolling Blackouts Coastal Fever.
Yes.
And
Okay.
yeah, they're doing pretty well here, and I think, everywhere. But the same thing, it has just like taken off in the UK.
Wow.
And they're headlining the Coco in London, and it's about to sell out, and that's not until October. But you can just tell there's something there. There's something there. And I think that is another one, especially for UK magazines, that will end up in the top five, like, best albums.
Wow. I
And it's
actually,
such a cool thing to be like, to kind of witness, because it's still pretty early. Like, this is their
right.
first full length album. Um, but yeah.
That must have come out in the winter or something because I remember that. I remember a lot of people tweeting about that, and I listened to it a few times. I loved it, but I have to revisit that.
Yeah, I'll have to send it to you.
Okay.
Um, it came out. They had two EPs come out, and then a few tracks came out this earlier in the year, and then the album came out in June.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. So I
Yeah,
remember. Yeah, I remember stuff coming out. Yeah, that's exciting. That's exciting when that happens with such a young
it
band.
is. Yeah, and like on the first album, by the time we did like the third Shins album, we knew what we were in.
Mm,
We
right.
kind of knew what we were dealing with. But when stuff like that happens on a band's first album, or even in like Low's case on their, I mean, what did we say it was? I don't even know what a Low album this is. For
Right.
Sub Pop, I feel like it's our seventh or
Oh wow.
something. Uh,
But it's over.
but
Yeah.
when something like this happens for a band that has been around for a really, really long time, that's also equally as exciting.
right.
You know, um, yeah, and you can kind of tell. And Postal Service was like a whole different thing. You're right, because it was a side project. They weren't really going to tour, and
Well,
that just totally took off.
even electronic music back then probably
Yeah,
like not huge in the mainstream,
right.
in the early 2000s.
Right. And then, another weird one was Flight of the Conchords.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Like, Brett and Jermaine it started off as just music, and then they did the HBO series.
Oh,
But
so the Sub Pop release came before that series?
it was, I can't remember what became before, but they were like a band. Like, I think we
Right.
had signed our deal with them before any TV.
I I haven't noticed. Maybe I'm maybe I just haven't noticed, but it seems like your label hasn't jumped on a bandwagon or hasn't like tried to like go all in on a genre when things go well, like after Postal Service, tons of electronic records, or after Fleet Foxes, everything was folks and beards and stuff, or same with comedy records. Like it seems like you do something and then move on. Is that intentional?
Um, that would be great if it was intentional. I think, you know, I feel like we work with a fair amount of comedians, and more like, I feel like we work with a lot of different genres, and within that we have a lot of bands in those genres. But yeah, I guess
Sure.
we're not like chasing down just because we signed this band and that seems to be going well, let's try to find the next thing
Right.
similar to that.
Yeah.
Because when someone's doing it so well, just let that person take
That's
care of
great.
it, you know?
That's great. Yeah. No, it's great. And let other people copy you. It's always better to be
Yeah.
the one copied than the
Yeah,
one copying.
exactly.
Yeah. Let's talk about marketing a little bit. And that's your role. I'm sorry. What is your title?
I'm marketing director.
Marketing director. And this
Yeah.
is, I mean, it's kind of, it's kind of interesting as we're talking about Low, and this record is as it's happening right now. You said that the band was interested in debuting these 3 songs and these 3 videos that went with it. And that happened. When did that happen? Was that like May or June?
Yeah, I think it was. I can't remember specifically, but it was May or June. And I think they had a tour coming up. And they either wanted to announce the tour dates with that, or they were over there playing dates,
Okay.
which I think they were playing dates overseas, and then we announced it.
Can you give me some insight into this thought process of when the record is done and mastered from the band, and it's and when you say, okay, this is going to be the release date, because to the folks at home, September 14th, I believe, is this, whatever this Friday is the release date. You gave these 3 singles back in May, June, which is a huge gap, especially if the songs are so damn great. It's kind of frustrating.
Yeah.
So what is that thought process? Like, and what kind of targets do you try to hit in between there for records like Low, as an example?
So we, you know what? I'm going to just quickly walk to my desk where I have all of this written down,
okay.
so I don't totally screw it up. Hang on one second.
Do you remember when the band first showed the label the record, or?
Yeah. So that must have been. So Sub Pop will work, like you just kind of said, backwards. Like
Okay.
a band will finish their album and turn it in, and then we usually say we need at least 22 weeks before that's the release day.
Wow.
Yeah. So they hand us the album, and we're like, okay, 22 weeks from now is this date. And is there already anything scheduled that date? Let's kind of, so it doesn't always happen at that exact time. And we try to get, we try to be a little bit smart with it. Even if they turn something in but couldn't tour for 2 years after, then maybe we should wait, or,
Okay.
try to have conversations like that.
Okay. I'm sorry. Can I interrupt you because I just have questions while we're doing this?
Yeah.
So
yeah, please.
You said that 22 weeks from when they handed in. Now, talking about that release date, is there any conversations that happen that say, okay, so the first thing you said was that you make sure there's no conflict. So I assume you mean conflicts within Sub Pop?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But what about other labels? What about if some other huge bands releasing on that day? Will you try to avoid that?
No.
Okay. Okay, that's great. Good.
No, we lean into it. No, honestly, we usually don't know at that time.
Right. Okay, that's true. Yeah.
If anything else has been scheduled
That's
on
a
that
good point.
date, and you can kind of get the sense of oh well, everyone really, because it's true. Usually, people really want a fall release or something going into summer. People don't normally want a midsummer release because it can be tricky, and a lot of it is when they have tour dates planned or what they're hoping to get, and are there festivals, we try to take into consideration the bigger picture, but for real. And this is, I'm kind of the deadline task master,
Right,
I guess.
right.
For real, if we don't have 22 weeks, it is a stress on everyone.
Yeah.
Just getting the production done and the artwork and all of that. So it is kind of starting from scratch. When they hand us the album, it's okay, what are we going to do?
Right.
And to try to do everything, we need 22 weeks, please,
And I mean, like you said, the fall is is such a great time. I mean, I feel like there's this huge, like, implicit, subconscious feeling that where like records are just received better in the
Yeah.
fall. Like I appreciate things better in the fall. Like culture tastes better in the fall. So that's got to be a thing. You've got to look and think the kids are back in school, college is in session. You know, September
Right.
is a great time for that.
Yep.
And
Yep.
and what
Exactly.
and what about like holidays, like the Friday leading into Thanksgiving? That's a no-no. I guess that's Black Friday for you guys.
I know. Yeah. We try to steer clear of it, and I'm trying to think if, yeah, we'll have like a Black Friday thing, and then
Sure.
that's it. And then it's always a question of like, well, how early in January? Should we try to push it? Should we try to do like the second Friday in January? And
Right.
um, all of a sudden, January has become a thing because it's usually like a quieter month.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you, I mean, I guess like, do year ends matter to you at all? I mean, like, it's like I've seen a lot of records come out at end of November and they're great records, but people are already working on their lists or release their list.
Right.
Do you care about that?
Yeah, that's a good point. We usually don't have November releases.
Oh,
We
okay.
do this year. We're doing a J Mascis album on November 9th.
Okay.
But honestly, as far as I can remember, we usually don't. Maybe it is for that reason, or I think everyone already kind of like switches off for the
Right.
year.
Right.
But that has been brought up as like a concern for January, February releases. Is like, oh, then we're gonna have to remind people of how
Oh my
great, like,
goodness. Yeah.
Frankie Cosmos came out
Yeah. That's right.
earlier this year, and
Yeah.
that's a great album, and we're gonna have to really make sure to remind people that it came out this year because the amount of music, of really great music, not just from Sub Pop, that is coming out is insane. You know.
Right. So, okay.
So
So I'm so fascinated with this timeline and if there's anything you don't want to say, you totally just tell me to shut up. But
yeah.
the okay, so do you know with this low record, we're using this as an example, September 14th, the release date, perfect time of year. So do you know that would you guys have started this process 22 weeks before that? Where would that have brought us?
We probably did. It was a different type of release though, because the band had such a strong vision.
Hmm.
Um, and they had a lot of these videos made themselves,
Okay.
or at least like in the works, even prior to us, like I think having the final album. So that was like a really big leg up.
Okay.
It is it has proven very challenging to try to get a video completed when you launch an album. That's what we call it, an album launch. But when we do an album announcement, which is anywhere 3 to 2.5 months prior to the actual release.
Okay.
Um, and so we usually don't have our crap together enough to
Right.
have a video out with it. Sometimes we do, and in Lowe's case, they did a lot of work themselves on getting these videos made. They had such a strong vision, and then we launched that album earlier than we normally would have because they did have these upcoming tour dates that they
Hmm.
wanted to include. So we
I
launched
see.
the Low album on June 12th with
Okay.
3 tracks.
Okay. June 12th. And then
Yeah.
when would the press get the full copy of the record?
I bet, especially in the UK, where I was mentioning they have, they were on the cover of Wire. There's such good press that has
Hmm.
run for this album. I think almost probably around that time,
Okay. Yeah.
just to like a small handful of people.
Sure.
Definitely not like a big servicing whatsoever.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. And
And
then we kind of held it because we did front load it so much with 3 tracks and 3 videos
yeah.
that we just put out the 4th track, Disarray,
Hmm. I remember
like
that.
a month ago, or like on August 16th.
Right. Yeah. And I mean that's such a unique thing doing those three tracks and then that's it, I guess, right? It was just 4 tracks and then the
Yeah.
record's out Friday. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
so the thing for you, one of the kind of alarm bells, or not alarm bells, but the thing that really piqued my interest in this record was a couple of journalists, just writers on Twitter, were just saying things like, I don't think people understand how great this Low record is. And then another journalist who obviously had a copy of it was commenting on that. And I just thought, wow, like for journalists to be kind of like, showing their hand ahead of time, just like not being able to keep it in, that's when I knew this must be a special record.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's amazing.
So you, marketing director, you worked your way up from an intern. Is that true?
That is true. Yeah.
That seems kind of like an indie movie or something.
Yeah, I know. I know. Believe me. I had like a jar growing up in the middle of Wisconsin that I would put my change in, and it was called Savings for Seattle. It's weird. It's
Really?
totally weird. Yeah.
For Sub Pop, or like, did you always want to work in the music industry?
Um, yeah, both of those things.
Oh,
And I was
oh,
weirdly
wow.
obsessed with like even Sub Pop as like an eighth grader and grunge and
Oh man,
everything. Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
beautiful.
it's crazy. It is crazy. So yeah, I eventually moved out here, and I was going to school at Western Washington University, and you can create your own major. And so I created music marketing, and
Wow.
I was just doing a bunch of internships, working at the station, college radio
Hmm.
station, and booking shows and doing all sorts of stuff. And then got an internship at Sub Pop, and spent like 6 months here or so. I think I made two different classes out of it, so it was like 2 quarters worth, and then graduated and was just like moved down to Seattle. Was working at a coffee shop because that can't get any more
Yeah.
stereotypical. Um, and I got a call from Megan and current CEO. And I don't know why I said current CEO. Megan is like a staple. She's been here forever.
Right, right.
And she was just like, hey, can you fill in for the front desk this week?
Hmm.
Dave, who was playing at the Shins at the time, was going on tour. And so I was like, great, I'll just wake up super early to do my coffee shift and then come in and just do the front desk. And, I kind of just, I
This
had
is a movie.
honestly,
This is a
oh
movie.
yeah,
This is a
yeah,
Zach Braff
I
movie.
had honestly had zero expectations, zero expectations, and was
Yeah.
just kind of doing my thing. And at the end of the week of just, answering the phones, Megan was like, well, yeah, we'd love to have you be Sean's assistant doing international marketing. And I don't even know what my face was doing. And I'm such a freaking dork. All I remember saying was like, I need to at least give my coffee job 2 weeks, so sorry, Sub Pop, you're going to hang so I can pull some more shots for two
Oh,
weeks.
right. Well, that shows loyalty.
But yeah.
That's so
And
funny.
so, yep, I started,
Unbelievable.
it's pretty amazing. And I spent, I guess, less than half. It feels like most of it was doing international marketing, which I loved. And then kind of moved into this position, which is but mainly because I replaced myself with a wonderful guy named Ryan who heads up our UK office. Um, it was at the time of Band of Horses and the Shins and
Mm.
wow, lots of stuff that I was going, and sounds very luxurious, and at times it was, but I was going overseas so much with our bands, and I think we kind of all felt like we needed an office there to
Right.
do everyone kind of justice and to be the intermediary between our distributors and just to have someone over there. And so we hired Ryan, and then luckily the position I'm in now opened up. So
Wow.
I didn't have to go anywhere.
That's
But
amazing. Congrats. That's so cool.
yeah,
Do you,
yeah.
do you I'm when I think of marketing, I'm wondering, do you promote, is marketing director, is that primarily the artists and the releases, or is marketing the brand and the label part of your job?
It's primarily the band and the releases. I do want it to be more of the label, but
Mm.
I kind of, weirdly, it's so interesting now because we have a store at SeaTac Airport, and
Okay, yeah, I
I
saw that.
think
Interesting.
Sub Pop is like so iconic. Like it's just like an iconic label that it kind of does its own marketing.
Right.
It makes me sound like a really lazy marketing director, but I don't think we've been that in your face
Right.
about the brands. Like we'd rather push our bands out and do that over Sub Pop brand. But
Yeah. Yeah.
and marketing kind of just includes looking after um the core marketing group is our publicity department, our social marketing department, our video department, radio, international. So there's a whole crew of great people.
A lot of us who run small one-person indie labels think of marketing as basically Facebook ads. Like,
Yeah.
what
Yeah, that's what
marketing?
I do too.
Okay, okay. What I was going to ask you, what marketing advice can you give us? Like, where should we be focusing our energy for these one person shops?
Yeah, I mean, you probably nailed it. It's insane how much social media has changed things.
Right.
And even like social media advertising. And I think I have no clue if it's a good or bad thing, but I think we've all kind of grown immune if you use social media when you see an ad,
Mm.
people don't get upset about it anymore.
Right. That's true. Yeah.
And it is a really great, cheap way to get the word out,
Right. And to
you
target.
know? Yeah. It's
Yeah.
kind of crazy.
Well, that's interesting because I know it is costly. It adds up, and but at the same time, like I look back and I think, wow, I've discovered things through personally. I've discovered records. I've had records pushed on me by major labels, and then I've checked it out and I'm like, oh, this is a great record. So
Right.
it does work on me, and it's hard to spend money on something like that.
Yeah, it is. I feel like that's a great way though. And we do a lot of that. And this year, weirdly, we've done a bunch of like outdoor advertising for our
Oh,
larger campaigns, but Low is one of them.
really? Like
Yeah,
billboards?
yeah, like tube,
Oh, that's
all
great.
especially in London, like tube posters and
Interesting. There's
all
a
that stuff.
there's a great label in the UK, Erase Tapes, that like the ambient
Uh-huh.
electronic label. They have Niels Fromm, and I noticed they did a lot of that too, and in America this year to promote his record. And I think that's really cool. I think that's just kind of like organic and vintage. Like it's interesting. I love
Yeah,
it.
I was kind of surprised. I was like, we're doing this again. Okay, but yeah, and we've done a handful of outdoor advertising for a bunch of different bands this year.
Well, it's
So
interesting because like a billboard is so uh, iconic, and when
yeah,
I see like I've never seen any billboards for Father John Misty or for this Niels Fromm record, but to see it on social media that these labels did billboards,
yeah,
it heightened my respect for these records or my interest because it was like, wow, they're doing a billboard,
yeah, right,
So that's
yeah.
kind of cool. I want to ask you, and I won't take up too much more of your time, but um, I want to ask you about what makes a successful album campaign, especially for some of us labels who the artists maybe don't have a big tour lined up, or we're not doing any out of home advertising. What would you what would you recommend? What would you suggest um, that makes a successful album campaign, starting from the beginning right to the release date?
hmm Um, Even though you mentioned that artist touring, I would say the artist having the artist's involvement.
Oh, okay.
Um, like if they come in, and even if they don't have like a clear idea on a video or even what they want their photos to look
Mm,
like, having them be involved in the process, being active on social media, not even like ads, but like on it, posting. It's always nice and it's not like mandatory, but when they're a little bit vulnerable, more than they already are, but like
Right.
talking about what they actually like and what inspired the album. And I think that goes a long way with fans, is just feeling that connection.
That's very true.
Yeah, but so like having them involved and play a part of it, as well as the label, goes a really, really long way. I think, when all the stars align, it's, them having a great tour lined up, putting out a few tracks beforehand and having people get really excited about them, and those tracks being playlisted on Spotify. And then the album comes out and the album gets great reviews, and then the band just tours for like a year.
Yeah.
And that goes really well. But I know all of that, that's the ideal situation.
Right.
Which isn't always possible all the time. But I think, we've been finding that, not to take away from Sub Pop, but when the bands are more active and like kind of talking about their albums themselves, especially on social media, that goes a long way.
That's true. I mean, that is a really good point. And I think I've worked on records where the artist is far away from me, so I'm not able to do video stuff, or in one case the artist was just lived out in the bush and just didn't have access to email. But and it's suffered, I think, even though there is like I've always hoped that there was like a cool romance to that mystery of who this artist is, but it has suffered, as opposed to an artist who comes in here and says, okay, can I email these guys for you? That really does help.
Yeah.
This has been so exciting, and I mean, to say I'm a fan of Sub Pop is ridiculous. Of course I'm a fan of Sub Pop. It's such a great label, and for this podcast, it is the top of the mountain, and I am so grateful. Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, of course. No, it was my pleasure.
I'm wondering, in case I ever send a demo to Sub Pop, does Sub Pop still do the Dear Loser letter? Is that a thing?
We do not.
Okay.
I don't think that would go over so well in today's world.
Right. Well, it's funny how like back whenever mail was the main thing, like you would just show your friends, hey, look, I got this. But now if you got like a really snarky email, it would go viral in a couple seconds.
Oh yeah. Yep. We try to keep a little bit of the snark in there, but definitely have toned it down, I think.
Well, again, thank you so much for doing this. This has been a great time.
Of course. Thank you.
And thank you for listening. This podcast is produced by Other Songs. We're a small record label in Canada, and you can check us out on Instagram at Other Songs and on Twitter at Other Songs, or at othersongsmusic.com. Subscribe to the podcast. Tell your friends. If you have any questions or suggestions, or you want to get involved in any way with your label, you can email me at info@otherrecordlabels.com. Oh, no. It's actually podcast at otherrecordlabels.com. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go make sure that info@otherrecordlabels.com works as well. But it's supposed to be podcast at otherrecordlabels.com. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to Sub Pop. You know how to find Sub Pop, and no doubt in my mind you've already bought records from them, but you can check them out at subpop.com and make sure you give them a follow. Thanks so much for listening.